I wanted to discuss like your view on like mind, your theory of mind. So I know that you're an identity theorist, but I think you might actually be an illusionist.
Right. So I don't think of myself as being like Dennett. Right. Dennett often got that accusation. Right. That he was an illusionist. He was kind of slippery on realism in general. If you read papers like Real Patterns, it's not clear whether he whether he really is a realist about patterns or not. Right. Um, So I don't think that I'm an illusionist at all, right? So I do something that Dennett might have been reluctant to do, certainly something that the Churchlands won't do. I'm quite happy to take it for granted that we're conscious, that we believe, we perceive, we feel, and so on. A whole lot of mental vocabulary. I'm happy to say that the claims couched in those terms are just true. But then I say there's a naturalistic analysis of each of these things in which it turns out that you're believing or you're perceiving or you're emoting or you're being conscious or whatever is just a matter of, and it we might argue about what the category is. So for now, I'll just use it events, stuff happening in your brain. Or and now it's not just stuff happening in your brain. It requires maybe history, environment, maybe social environment as well. There's a sort of external stuff that's required. But what the belief or the emotion or the perception is the stuff that's happening in your brain. Right. So that makes it, I think, an identity theory and not an illusionism. Right. So, so this is using the terms that Smart used when he wrote Sensations and Brain Processes. And although that paper was much criticised by people like Putnam and Kripke and so on, I've eventually come around to the view that Smart was right and his critics were wrong, more or less.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. The reason why I worry that you might be an illusionist is because, in an email exchange with me, you said that in the case of mental states and physical states, what remains to be explained is only how it has come about that many people make the mistake of supposing that there are two things there when there is just one. So, do you think that the differentiation between the mental and physical is a introspective mistake or something like that?
I don't think that it's an introspective mistake, it's just a mistake, right? Uh, so, and there's lots of ways that that could come about. I mean, one is just by reading too much Descartes, or or other. I mean, in the other people in the philosophical tradition, reading idealists, reading, you know, when the Cartesian thing was going on, there all those people, occasionalists, and all kinds of weird positions, right? It's not introspection that's doing the damage, right? It's it's philosophizing that's leading people up the garden path, according to me.
But they, all of these people, they're trying to probe the introspection of the reader. They make introspect about what.
Well, maybe. I mean, what they want, I think that this has much more to do with life after death than anything else, right? We're going to be very hard pressed to make sense of the next life if we're smart identity theorists, right? And so there's a pressure that operated right through the early modern and modern period for um, people to deliver up theories of the relationship between the mind and the body that would let the mind go into the next life when the body obviously didn't. Right. And so I don't think that it's introspection. I think that's the most significant driving force for for all of the early moderns.
But yeah, I mean, um, I still think, the idea that it is a mistake to sort of differentiate mental and physical while there is just physical. I think that is like the illusionist argument.
So, okay, but it's not, I didn't say that there's no distinction between, for example, walking and believing, right? Walking is a merely physical property, whereas believing is a mental property. It's just that what they are, in the one case, the walking has to do with the motion of the entire body, whereas the believing just has to do with some stuff that's happening in your brain. And that's what's distinctive, right? It's not. I mean, I started off by saying I don't deny that there are truths about consciousness and believing and perception and so on. So I don't deny that there are truths about the mental. It's just that what the mental is stuff happening in your brain.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, so like when you like really think about it, right? So beliefs are always about something. I believe in God, right? It has a content that it is referring to, but like a neural process doesn't really have like a content, or it is not about anything.
So on the contrary, right? We'll start with perception. Maybe that's the easiest case, and we'll stop thinking about people, but think about dogs or chimpanzees or something like that. There's no question that um, they see things in the world, right? They can see sticks and bananas and tennis balls, all kinds of things. And it's also clear, I think, that they have something that functions in the way that lots of our beliefs do in guiding their actions, right? And you get surprises. Like you take your cat and you put it in front of a mirror, and its reaction indicates that it was expecting something else. It wasn't expecting this thing that it can't smell. And when it tries to touch it, it can't touch it, but it can see it there. And it right. I mean, there's no. I don't think there's any problem, right, about it.
So yeah, I mean, I just think that like you still sort of differentiate mental and physical properties. Like there are these differentiating properties that sort of differentiate like these two categories, right?
So you could think of that as um, a product of the, forever people have thought that there was a next life, or they thought that there's a cycle of reincarnation and you have many lives. And either of those requires the separate existence of the thing that supports. And now we give you the range of properties that we imagine are supported because we imagine, right, that kind of thing here is that it's what animates the body, right? And so it's all of the mental vocabulary. It doesn't mean that there's that. I mean, our continuing to preserve that distinction between the two classes of properties isn't something that you can draw metaphysical conclusions from.
So let's just take the example of Superman and Clark Kent, right? So we have that's the classic identity theory example, right? But if you look really closely into this example, what essentially happens is the the differences in the properties, the differentiating properties that sort of differentiate Clark Kent and Superman are a mistake, right? Like people don't have like a complete perspective on what the actual properties of the person they are, interacting with is. It's not the properties that they attribute to Clark Kent or Superman. The viewers who sort of watch the movie sort of understand what the real, properties of this agent is, and the people in that DC universe, in that world, they're just mistaken. They sort of they're under an illusion that some properties are applicable to Clark Kent, and some other properties are applicable to Superman. Right. That is how I see the relation between mind.
Right. Okay. And so that means that that analogy is not really super helpful when you're thinking about Smart's theory about the mental properties, because uh, it's not that there's it's not like we're supposing um, that all of us have got this view of where we think that there's this thing and that thing, and we think that they're distinct when in fact there's just one thing that we're looking at. Because that does sound a bit like, okay, so these people are confused, right? You don't end up thinking that there's two things where there's one unless there's a mistake happening somewhere. Um, whether they're under, whether you should say they're under an illusion, depends a bit on what we want to talk about when we're using the word illusion. I mean, they're just making a mistake of a certain kind. Okay. Now, when we come to the case about the mind and brain, it's not that there are these two separate things that we've got a view on, that what two apparently separate things that we've got a view on, right? Because we don't the only perspective that we've got on our own, the processings in our own brain is from the perspective of what it's like to have those things going on, right? Like my access to your processing is nil, right? Right. Um, so it feels like the case is slightly different, right? Um, there is just one thing, the stuff that's going on in your brain. That's what we're talking about, right? And then there's this, in my view, misguided theory that goes back way through history of thinking that there are two, right? That there are that there's something else because that's a requirement of our being able to exist in the next life, right?
Okay. Interesting. But yeah, I mean, it's the way I understand the illusionist position, right? So the problem is illusionism is a broad camp, right? And there are some people who think that the illusion of the mind and neurons being different is just because of philosophizing. It's these philosophers who sort of, cause this trouble. So there are illusionists who take that stance. So that is the reason why I wonder if, your position might be similar to those people, you know. So yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay, but then maybe I'm balking at the kind of the the label illusionist unnecessarily in that case, right? So uh, what I mean, what I think is that it's false, that there's something separate from our bodies that survives and goes on to the next life, and that's the bearer of a whole lot of our properties. We're just one thing, right? So the organism is the bearer of all of its properties, right? And I mean, those people who thought that there was this other bit that survived into the next life and identified certain properties with it, we can now come back and say, well, actually, we do have all of those properties, right? The organism has those properties. The organism sees and perceives and feels and so on, right? Um, and it's not, so now it's certainly not the properties that are taken to be illusory. If there's something illusory here, it's the idea that there's a separately existing thing that will be there in the next life.
Yeah. So, I think the way the word illusion is used sort of, puts some people away. But the way I understand it, all illusion means is, there is something false that people believe to be true. That's all. Like the what.
So there is something here, but it's not that we believe and think and perceive and so on, which is, that would be the kind of eliminativist view that Dennett sometimes gets charged with, though he vehemently insisted that that wasn't his position, right? Right. I mean, his position, if there's something that's illusory here, it's the idea that there's a separately existing thing that will, that maybe had prior lives and will have a future life. Right? And in that sense, I'm an illusionist, right? I mean, given what the way that you've described it, I don't think that that we have that kind of composition.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, that is the way I understand the position. So essentially, you know, it's just your brain that does all the work, but because of some reasons, people are mistaken and they believe that you know their mental processes are not their brain processes. It's something different from brain processes. It has some other properties. It is like private, while the processes are not private, and so on. And
But we have no direct insight into how our brains work. In fact, I mean, we have only a small amount of insight into how human brains work in general so far, right? And so it's not like there's an identification that anybody can make of particular believings or perceivings or so on with particular processes happening in brains. We just don't know that anywhere near enough about how brains work to make any kinds of identifications of that kind.
yeah, I mean, I guess their point would be, let's just say, both of us are neuroscientists, right? And we have these machineries that are hooked up on our heads, and we can see each other's brains. We still wouldn't be able to, like, you know, sort of experience, or like it's still a private experience. All of the.
Right. So, sure, but that's fine because, I mean, this is something that I said before. There's something that it's like to have this processing going on. There's something that it's like to see things, to feel things, to hear things, and so on. And only the person who's having the process gets that particular knowing what it's like, right? So, of course, if I could, even if I kind of was the neuroscientist, the omniscient neuroscientist looking into your head, I would only know by projecting from my own experience what it feels like for you, right? Of course, that's not problematic.